38 million acres of white pine forest. Trees so tall they blocked out the sun, trunks so wide it took 3 men linking arms to wrap around them. In 1850, Michigan held one of the largest stands of virgin timber in the entire world. By 1900, it was gone. All of it. Stripped down to stumps and sawdust. And here's what makes this story almost impossible to believe. They did it without chainsaws, without bulldozers, without a single piece of motorized equipment, just axes, crosscut saws, and the muscle of men who worked for $1 a day. In roughly 30 years, an army of laborers known as shanty boys cleared an area larger than the state of Georgia. They felled trees that had stood for 300 years. They floated billions of board feet of lumber down frozen rivers. And they transformed Michigan from an endless green wilderness into a landscape of charred stumps and failed farms. The lumber barons who orchestrated this became some of the richest men in American history. The workers who made it possible lived 30 to a bunkhouse, sleeping head to toe with strangers, eating salt pork and beans, dying in numbers that were never officially counted. This is the story of the Great Michigan Cutover, the largest deforestation event in American history up to that point, a story of unimaginable wealth, brutal labor, environmental catastrophe, and a lesson we still haven't fully learned. To understand how 30 years of axe work erased millions of acres of forest, you first need to understand what Michigan looked like before the loggers arrived. Picture this. It's 1840. You're standing at the shore of Lake Huron, looking west into Michigan's interior. What stretches before you isn't just a forest, it's a cathedral. White pine trees tower 150 feet into the air. Their lowest branches start 60 feet up. The forest floor is dark even at midday because the canopy is so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. These trees are old. Some of them sprouted before Columbus reached the Americas. They've survived fires, droughts, and centuries of storms. Their trunks are perfectly straight, with virtually no knots for the first 50 or 60 feet. This matters because knot-free wood is worth more money. It's stronger. It's easier to work with. And white pine happens to be soft enough to cut with hand tools, but durable enough to build cities. The eastern white pine, Pinus strubus, was the perfect tree for 19th century construction. It grew straight and true. Its wood was light enough to transport easily, but strong enough to frame buildings. It resisted rot better than many hardwoods. It could be worked with simple tools. And Michigan had more of it than anyone could possibly count. Surveyors who traveled through Michigan in the 1830s wrote about forests so dense they could barely push through. They described trees growing so close together that a squirrel could travel from the Indiana border to the Straits of Mackinac without ever touching the ground. They measured individual trees over 200 feet tall, their trunks 6 feet across at the base. These were the monarchs of the northern forest, older than the oldest European cathedrals. The Native Americans who lived here for thousands of years took what they needed: a tree for a canoe, bark for a dwelling. They understood the forest as a living system. They had no reason to cut more than they could use. The Ojibwe, the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, they had lived with these trees for generations. They called the white pine the tree of peace and used its resin for medicine, its bark for containers, its wood for shelters, but they never imagined harvesting it at industrial scale. The concept would have seemed insane. But by the 1840s, a different kind of hunger was arriving. America was expanding westward at a pace that defied logic. Chicago's population doubled, then doubled again. The city was being built almost entirely from wood, and that wood had to come from somewhere. Into the Great Plains were being settled by families who needed houses, barns, and fences. And the prairies had one critical problem. There were no trees. The demand for lumber exploded overnight, and every lumber buyer in America knew exactly where to find it. Michigan's white pine forests contained an estimated 170 billion board feet of standing timber. To put that in perspective, a single board foot is a piece of wood 1 foot long, 1 foot wide, and 1 inch thick. 170 billion of those. Enough to build every house in America several times over. At the time, this seemed like an inexhaustible supply. It would have taken a normal rate of consumption centuries to deplete it. But nothing about what was coming would be normal. The only question was how to get it out. The answer to that question emerged in a place called the Saginaw Valley. This stretch of land along the Saginaw River became ground zero for the Michigan logging industry. It had everything the lumber barons needed. Dense stands of white pine within a few miles of the river, water deep enough to float logs downstream, and access to Lake Huron, which connected to shipping routes that could move lumber anywhere in the country. The geography was perfect for extraction. The Saginaw River drained a watershed of over 6,000 square miles, all of it covered with prime timber. Every creek and tributary in that watershed could be used to move logs toward the main river. And the Saginaw emptied into Saginaw Bay, which opened onto Lake Huron, which connected to Lake Michigan, which led directly to Chicago and the hungry markets of the Midwest, aimed to be. Logs cut anywhere in that watershed could be floated to the mills at Saginaw. From there, finished lumber could be loaded onto ships bound for Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, or anywhere else the growing nation needed building materials. The entire system functioned like a massive conveyor belt, moving trees from forest to city. At the height of the industry, the Saginaw River would be so choked with floating logs during spring drives that you could walk across it without getting your feet wet. Millions of board feet moving together like a slow wooden flood, heading for the massive sawmills that lined both banks of the river. The sound of those mills running day and night became the constant background noise of the city, the shriek of circular saws cutting through pine, the rumble of logs rolling off conveyor belts, the splash of finished boards being stacked and sorted. The mills themselves were engineering marvels for their time, steam-powered behemoths that could process an entire log in minutes. A tree that had taken 200 years to grow could be reduced to stacked lumber in less time than it takes to eat lunch. The efficiency was remarkable. The waste was equally remarkable. Sawdust and scrap piled up in mountains behind the mills, eventually becoming fire hazards of their own. The first sawmills appeared in the 1830s. Small operations. A handful of men cutting local timber for local use. The early mills were powered by water, using the river's current to turn the blades that sliced logs into boards. Their capacity was measured in thousands of board feet per day, barely enough to supply local needs. But by the 1850s, the scale had changed completely. Investors from New York, Boston, and Chicago saw the fortunes waiting to be made. They bought up thousands of acres of timberland, often for less than $1 per acre. They replaced the small water-powered mills with massive steam-driven operations capable of processing millions of board feet per year. And they began building an industry that would transform the American landscape. The men who ran this industry became known as lumber barons. Names like David Ward, who built a lumber empire in the Saginaw Valley and became one of the wealthiest men in Michigan. Ward had arrived in Michigan as a young man with nothing but ambition. He learned the lumber business from the ground up, working in mills, managing crews, studying every aspect of how trees became money. By the time he died, he owned more land than some European nobles. His mansion in Saginaw was a monument to the wealth that could be extracted from trees, built from the finest wood his crews could cut. Charles Hackley made his fortune in Muskegon, on the western side of the state. He started as a mill hand, earning 50 cents a day, and ended up owning the mills. Hackley had a gift for organization, for seeing how to make operations more efficient, how to squeeze more profit from every tree. At the peak of his wealth, Hackley was reportedly earning profits of $1 million per year, at a time when the average worker made less than $500 annually. That's roughly equivalent to making $200 million a year today. From cutting down trees, Henry Crapo arrived in Michigan as a land speculator from Massachusetts, some intending to buy and sell property for quick profits. Instead, he saw the potential in timber and stayed. Crapo ended up serving as the state's governor, while his lumber business made him rich beyond measure. He saw no conflict between running the state government and running a timber empire. Neither did anyone else, apparently. The interests of the lumber industry and the interests of the state were assumed to be identical. These men weren't evil in any simple sense. They were products of their time, applying the prevailing logic of American capitalism to an unprecedented opportunity. Resources existed to be extracted. The forest wasn't a complex ecosystem to be managed. It was a commodity to be liquidated as quickly as possible. Get the trees, get them to market, move on to the next stand. There was no concept of replanting. No thought of sustainability. The forest seemed infinite. When one section was cleared, you simply moved to the next. The idea that the white pine could actually run out seemed absurd to men standing in the middle of 38 million acres of trees. But turning those standing trees into money required something the lumber barons couldn't buy at any price: labor. Brutal, dangerous, backbreaking labor. And for that, they needed the shanty boys. The shanty boys. That's what they called them. Not loggers, not lumberjacks, shanty boys. Young men, mostly. Some barely out of their teens. They came from failed farms in New England, where rocky soil and short growing seasons had crushed their families' agricultural dreams. From the slums of East Coast cities, where immigrants competed for any work that paid wages. From Canada and Scandinavia, chasing rumors of steady work and regular meals. Irish immigrants fleeing the famine, French Canadians moving south, Germans and Swedes and Norwegians who had heard that America was a land of opportunity. What they found was something closer to organized survival. A logging camp in the 1870s, Michigan looked nothing like what you might imagine. Forget comfortable cabins with roaring fireplaces. These camps were temporary settlements built for maximum efficiency and minimum cost. The lumber companies calculated exactly how much they could spend on worker housing and still turn a profit. The answer was not much. The central structure was the bunkhouse, a building roughly 16 feet by 20 feet. Inside that space, 30 men would live for an entire winter. 30 men, in a room smaller than a modern two-car garage. They slept on wooden bunks stacked too high, arranged in rows along both walls. The standard configuration was called double bunking, meaning 2 men shared each sleeping space, positioned head to toe. You went to sleep with a stranger's feet next to your face. You woke up with them still there. There were no mattresses, just wooden platforms covered with hay or pine boughs that quickly became infested with lice and bedbugs. There was no privacy, no personal space, no way to escape the smell of 30 unwashed men who worked 12-hour days in freezing temperatures. The camps had no running water, no bathing facilities, and no laundry service. Men wore the same clothes for months at a time, the fabric stiffening with accumulated sweat and grime. They hung their wet socks and boots near the central stove each night, and filling the bunkhouse with a permanent stench of sweat and wood smoke and damp wool that witnesses described as nearly unbearable. The heating came from a single stove in the center of the room, fed constantly to keep the temperature above freezing. Men closest to the stove roasted while men near the walls shivered. Some camps had chinking between the logs, mud and moss packed into the gaps. Others didn't bother, leaving the wind to whistle through cracks that let in snow and cold. The food was monotonous and barely adequate. Salt pork, beans, hard bread, occasionally dried apples or prunes to prevent scurvy. The camp cook, usually called a cookie, worked nearly as hard as the loggers, preparing massive quantities of food in primitive conditions. A hungry logging crew could eat 50 pounds of beans in a single sitting. The men ate in silence, a tradition that supposedly developed because arguments at meals wasted time. Whether that's true or just a legend, the result was the same. Rows of exhausted men shoveling food into their mouths without speaking, then stumbling back to the bunkhouse to sleep before doing it all again tomorrow. For this, they earned roughly $1 per day plus room and board. That dollar sounds small today, but adjusted for inflation, it was actually reasonable pay for unskilled labor in the 1870s. The problem wasn't the daily wage, the problem was what they had to do to earn it, and what it did to them. Logging work started before dawn and continued until darkness made it impossible to swing an axe safely. In Michigan's winters, that meant working in temperatures that regularly dropped below zero. On 20 below wasn't unusual. 30 below happened. Frostbite was common. So were crushed limbs, severed fingers, and deaths from falling trees. There was no workers' compensation, no disability insurance, no safety equipment beyond whatever common sense the workers themselves could muster. If you got hurt badly enough that you couldn't work, you were sent home with whatever money you'd earned. If you died, the company might send a letter to your family. Might not. The primary tools were the axe and the crosscut saw. Felling a mature white pine, a tree that might be 4 feet across at the base, required 2 men working in coordinated rhythm. One would chop a notch on the side where the tree should fall, swinging a double-bit axe with precision developed over months or years of practice. The notch had to be exactly right, too shallow, and the tree might fall the wrong way, too deep, and you'd waste valuable trunk wood. The axe itself was a work of art. A good logging axe weighed 3 to 4 pounds, with a head forged from high-carbon steel that could hold an edge through a day of chopping. The handle was white ash or hickory, carved to fit the user's hands perfectly. Men developed personal relationships with their axes, sharpening them every night, treating them with more care than they treated themselves. Then both men would take positions on opposite ends of a crosscut saw. A flexible blade, sometimes 10 feet long with teeth designed to cut on both the push and pull stroke. They called it the misery whip. Working a crosscut saw in freezing temperatures for hours at a time against wood that could be rock hard with cold was exhausting beyond description. The men developed a rhythm that became almost musical. Push, pull, the saw singing through the wood, sawdust piling up on the frozen ground, your arms burning, your back screaming, your lungs aching from the cold air. The technique required perfect coordination. If one man pushed while the other pulled too hard, the saw would bind. If the rhythm fell apart, the blade would stick. Experienced sawyers could work for hours in perfect synchronization, their movements so attuned that they could anticipate each other's motions without thinking. A good team could fell a large pine in about 30 minutes. Then they'd move to the next tree, and the next, and the next. Day after day, week after week, from November to March. An experienced crew could fell dozens of trees per day, thousands per season. Multiply that by hundreds of crews working across millions of acres, and you begin to understand how the forest disappeared. The winter timing was critical. Frozen ground meant the heavy logs could be dragged on sleds without sinking into mud. Frozen rivers meant ice roads could be built to transport logs to collection points. Everything about Michigan logging was designed around the brutal reality of a northern winter. Once trees were felled, they had to be limbed and bucked into manageable lengths. This meant more axe work, chopping off branches and cutting the trunk into sections that could be moved. Then came the skidding, dragging logs through the forest to collection points using teams of horses or oxen. The teamsters who drove these animals were skilled specialists. They had to navigate massive loads through dense forest, avoiding stumps and rocks, keeping the animals moving without injury. A good team of horses could move logs that weighed several tons, but one misstep could mean a broken leg, a destroyed sled, or a dead animal worth more than a year of a worker's wages. The logs collected at riverbanks throughout the winter piled in enormous stacks called rollways. Some of these rollways contained millions of board feet of timber, logs stacked higher than houses, waiting for spring. The sight of these massive log piles was one of the industrial wonders of the age. Photographers traveled to Michigan specifically to capture images of rollways stretching for hundreds of yards, testament to the scale of extraction underway. Then, when spring arrived and the ice broke up, came the most spectacular and dangerous phase of the operation: the river drive. Imagine millions of board feet of logs released simultaneously into a swollen spring river. The water would be running high with snowmelt, moving fast and cold, often carrying chunks of ice along with the timber. The logs would tumble and crash together, forming temporary jams that could stretch for hundreds of yards. And walking on top of those unstable, rotating, water-slicked logs would be the river drivers. These men were considered the elite of the logging industry. They wore red flannel shirts and broad-brimmed hats. They carried long poles, called peavies, a combination of hook and spike that could grip a log and lever it into motion. They wore boots with caulked soles, metal spikes that gripped the wet wood but could also cut through a man's leg if he fell wrong. River drivers jumped from log to log across churning water, and sometimes in rapids, sometimes through stretches where the river narrowed and the logs piled up in chaotic tangles. They worked from dawn to dusk, standing knee-deep in ice-cold water, shoving logs, breaking jams, keeping the flow moving downstream toward the sawmills. When a jam formed, someone had to find the key log, the one holding the whole mess together, and free it. This often meant climbing out onto an unstable pile of timber suspended over rushing water, swinging an axe at precisely the right spot, and then running for your life as thousands of logs suddenly released and crashed downstream. The death rate among river drivers was never officially tracked, but the contemporary accounts suggest it was horrific. Drowning, crushing, hypothermia, men swept under by logs and never seen again. Men trapped in jams and killed when the pile shifted. Men who simply fell into ice-cold water and couldn't get out before the cold killed them. The rivers that carried Michigan's timber to market also carried away an unknown number of men whose bodies were sometimes found miles downstream, sometimes never found at all. And through all of this, the lumber barons grew rich beyond imagination. The peak of Michigan logging came in 1888, when the state produced 5.5 billion board feet of lumber in a single year. That's more than any state had ever produced, more than any state would ever produce again. Michigan alone was supplying timber for half the nation's construction needs. To give you a sense of scale, 5.5 billion board feet is enough lumber to build over 300,000 houses in 1 year from one state, cut by hand. The money flowing through cities like Saginaw, Muskegon, and Bay City was staggering. These towns developed reputations for both wealth and wildness. Saloons and brothels catered to loggers spending their winter earnings in a few explosive weekends. Churches and schools served the families of mill workers and business owners. Lumber barons built mansions on the best streets, monuments to fortunes built on the labor of men who earned $1 a day. Charles Hackley's house in Muskegon featured hand-carved woodwork, stained glass windows, and craftsmanship that took years to complete. The irony of building a monument to wealth from wood in a city whose wealth came from destroying forests seems to have occurred to no one at the time. David Ward accumulated enough wealth to become one of the largest landowners in Michigan history. Henry Crapo served as governor while maintaining his lumber interests, a conflict of interest that nobody seemed to find troubling. His son William would go on to found an automobile company. You might have heard of it, Buick. But here's the thing about extractive industries. They extract until there's nothing left. The 5.5 billion board feet cut in 1888 wasn't sustainable. It wasn't even close to sustainable. The lumber companies had been cutting at maximum speed for 3 decades, with no replanting, no conservation, no thought for what would happen when the trees ran out. By the early 1890s, the signs were impossible to ignore. Crews had to travel farther and farther to find virgin timber. The largest and most accessible trees were gone. What remained was smaller, lower quality, harder to reach. The easy money was disappearing. And in the wake of the loggers came something even more destructive: fire. The cutover lands weren't empty. They were covered with slash, the logging term for the branches, treetops, and debris left behind after the merchantable timber was removed. Miles and miles of dried-out, resin-rich pine debris baking under summer sun. The slash could be several feet deep in places, a tangle of branches and bark and pine needles, all of it saturated with flammable resin. All it needed was a spark. On October 8, 1871, while the world focused on the Great Chicago Fire, a far deadlier catastrophe was unfolding across Lake Michigan. The Peshtigo Fire, centered in Wisconsin but spreading into Michigan's Upper Peninsula, killed between 1,500 and 2,500 people in a single night. The exact death toll will never be known because entire communities were incinerated, leaving no one to count the dead. Many victims were burned beyond recognition. Entire towns simply ceased to exist. The fire created its own weather, generating winds of tornado force that spread flames faster than anyone could run. Witnesses described walls of fire hundreds of feet high, advancing at terrifying speed. The air itself seemed to catch fire. People running for the river still died before reaching water 100 yards away, their lungs seared by superheated air. The Peshtigo fire remains the deadliest in American history. More people died in that single night than in the Great Chicago Fire, the San Francisco earthquake, and most natural disasters you could name. But it was barely covered in the press because everyone was focused on Chicago. And it wasn't an anomaly, it was a consequence. 10 years later, in 1881, the Thumb Fire swept through Michigan's Thumb region, killing 282 people and destroying over 1 million acres. Again, the fire fed on, left behind by logging operations. Again, towns vanished in hours. Again, bodies were found in fields, in wells, in root cellars where families had hidden hoping to survive. The fire moved so fast that farmers who tried to outrun it on horseback were overtaken and killed in the middle of roads. The pattern was clear. Log the trees, leave the slash, wait for drought, watch it burn. These weren't natural disasters. They were man-made catastrophes, the direct result of an extraction model that took everything of value and left behind kindling. The lumber barons who profited from the timber bore no legal responsibility for the fires that followed. They had already moved on, chasing the next fortune in Wisconsin, Minnesota, or the Pacific Northwest. And the people left behind in Michigan, they were offered a solution that turned out to be another trap. As the lumber industry collapsed, the cutover lands went on the market, millions of acres, suddenly available for pennies on the dollar. Railroad companies and land speculators launched aggressive campaigns targeting farmers in the East and immigrants arriving from Europe. The pitch was simple: cheap land, rich soil, the opportunity to own your own farm in America's heartland. The advertisements showed happy families standing before fertile fields. They promised abundant harvests, comfortable homes, and the American dream of land ownership. What they didn't mention was that white pine forests grew in sandy soil. Sand is great for pine trees. It drains quickly, which pine roots prefer. The trees themselves had created what fertility existed, dropping needles that decomposed into a thin layer of organic matter over thousands of years. But once the trees were gone, what remained was sand. Sand holds no water, it contains few nutrients. Crops planted in sandy soil struggle, fail, and die. The advertisements didn't mention this. Neither did the land agents who sold farms to hopeful immigrants. Thousands of families bought cut-over land, expecting to build prosperous farms. What they found was something closer to a moonscape. Stumps everywhere, making it nearly impossible to plow. Soil that wouldn't support basic crops. No trees for building materials or firewood, in a climate where winter temperatures dropped well below zero. And, of course, the constant threat of fire from the remaining slash. The agricultural failure of the cut-over lands is one of the great forgotten tragedies of American history. Families who had invested everything in the promise of cheap land found themselves trapped. They couldn't grow enough to survive. They couldn't sell land that nobody wanted. They couldn't afford to leave. Many simply gave up, abandoning farms that had never really functioned as farms, drifting towards cities to look for factory work. The lumber towns suffered their own kind of collapse. When the trees ran out, the sawmills closed. When the mills closed, the workers left. Towns that had boomed with 10,000 residents shrank to a few hundred. On buildings that had housed saloons, hotels, and general stores stood empty, their windows broken, their roofs collapsing under the weight of Michigan snow. Some of the lumber barons reinvested their fortunes in their communities. Charles Hackley gave millions to Muskegon, funding the library, the hospital, the art museum that still bear his name. He built schools and parks and civic buildings. He tried, in his later years, to give back some fraction of what he had taken. Others simply took their money and left. They had extracted what they came for. Michigan's problems were no longer their concern. By 1900, the white pine was essentially gone. A few isolated stands remained, protected by accident of geography or luck. But the vast forests that had covered 38 million acres vanished, converted to lumber, shipped across the country, and built into houses, barns, and fences that served a nation too busy expanding to notice what had been destroyed in the process. The scale of the loss is difficult to comprehend. In roughly 50 years, human beings using hand tools eliminated one of the largest temperate forests in North America. They did it without environmental impact studies, without regulation, without any organized opposition. The trees were there, the market wanted them. The men willing to do the work could be found. That was all the justification anyone needed. Consider the speed of destruction. In 1850, Michigan's white pine forests covered 38 million acres. By 1870, the industry was just hitting its stride. By 1890, the forests were nearly gone. That's 4 decades, a single human lifetime. Trees that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. So trees that had stood when Shakespeare was writing plays, trees that had been saplings when the Aztecs ruled Mexico, all of them converted to boards and shipped to cities that would forget they ever existed. The methods were primitive by modern standards, but devastatingly effective. Men working with hand tools, guided by nothing more than the profit motive, achieved rates of deforestation that would take industrial machinery to match. They didn't need chainsaws, they had something better, an endless supply of desperate workers willing to trade their health for $1 a day. The environmental consequences extended far beyond the obvious. The forests had regulated water flow, preventing floods in spring and maintaining stream levels in summer. Without trees, erosion accelerated dramatically. Rivers that had run clear began carrying loads of silt that destroyed fish-spawning grounds. The Saginaw River, once famous for its abundant fish populations, became too polluted and silted to support aquatic life. Wildlife that had depended on the pine forests disappeared. The passenger pigeon, which had nested in Michigan's woods by the millions, was pushed toward the extinction that would come in 1914. Elk and caribou vanished from the state. Black bear populations crashed and wouldn't recover for decades. Wolves and mountain lions, once common throughout Michigan, were exterminated entirely. The climate itself changed. Forests moderate temperature extremes, cooling summer heat and providing windbreaks in winter. Without them, Michigan's weather became more volatile. The growing season shortened in some areas. Frost came earlier and stayed later. None of this was unknown at the time. Observers wrote about the destruction, warning that the reckless pace of logging would leave nothing for future generations. But their voices were drowned out by the sound of falling trees and the clink of gold coins changing hands. Today, if you drive through northern Michigan, you won't see a wasteland of stumps. You'll see forests, mile after mile of trees, stretching to the horizon in every direction. How is that possible? The answer is time and the remarkable resilience of natural systems when humans finally step back. After the logging era ended and the agricultural dreams failed, much of the cutover land simply sat abandoned. Nobody wanted it. Nobody managed it. And slowly, over decades, the forest began to return. First came the pioneer species, aspen and birch, trees that thrive in disturbed areas in full sunlight. They grew fast, covering the sandy soil with shade that helped hold moisture. Beneath them, other species found footholds: red pine, jack pine, and eventually, in some areas, white pine itself, growing back from seeds dropped by the few surviving parent trees. This second growth forest isn't the same as what the loggers destroyed. The ancient trees, the giants that had stood for 3 centuries, are gone forever. You cannot regrow a 300-year-old tree in a human lifetime. The ecosystem that evolved over millennia cannot be recreated in decades. The forest that exists today is younger, smaller, and less diverse than what stood in 1850. But it's a forest, and that fact alone represents a kind of accidental victory. The federal government played a role as well. In the early 20th century, conservationists convinced Congress to establish national forests on some of the most devastated cutover lands. The idea was radical for its time. Instead of selling public land to private interests, the government would hold it in trust, managing it for long-term benefit rather than short-term profit. The Huron-Manistee National Forest, established in 1909, now covers nearly 1 million acres of land that was once logged bare. The trees growing there today are managed under sustainable forestry principles that would have seemed absurd to the lumber barons, but that have allowed the forest to recover while still providing timber, recreation, and wildlife habitat. Private conservation efforts contributed as well. Organizations bought up cut-over land and protected it from development. Some former lumber barons, perhaps seeking redemption in their final years, donated land for parks and preserves. The Civilian Conservation Corps, during the Great Depression, planted millions of trees on land that had been bare for decades. Today, about 50% of Michigan is forested again. That's down from the 95% that existed before European settlement, but up enormously from the devastation of 1900. Black bears have returned. Elk were reintroduced in the 1980s and now have a stable population of over 1,000 animals. The rivers, while still damaged, support fish again in most areas. Wild turkeys, beavers, and otters have made comebacks. The Great Michigan Cutover offers a complicated lesson. On one hand, it's a story of catastrophic environmental destruction driven by greed, enabled by a complete absence of regulation, and inflicted on workers who had few other options and bore the physical costs of others' profits. It's a warning about what happens when extraction is treated as the only purpose of natural resources. On the other hand, it's also a story of recovery. Not complete recovery. Not recovery to the original state, but recovery nonetheless. The forests came back because forests are resilient systems that want to grow. Given enough time and the absence of continued destruction, nature tends toward regeneration. The question is whether we can learn from this, whether we can look at the Great Michigan Cutover and recognize the pattern that keeps repeating. Extract everything as fast as possible. Ignore the consequences. Move on when there's nothing left. Let future generations deal with the mess. We're still doing this. The resources change, but the logic remains identical. The lumber barons didn't think they were doing anything wrong. They were businessmen responding to market signals. The market wanted lumber. They provided it. That's capitalism. That's progress. That's America. And in the process, they destroyed one of the largest temperate forests in North America in a single human lifetime, using nothing more than axes and muscle and the willingness to treat both trees and workers as infinitely expendable resources. 38 million acres, gone in 30 years, done by hand. The shanty boys who swung those axes are long dead now. The lumber barons who profited from their labor are long dead too. What remains is the forest, slowly growing back, and the choice we face about whether to learn anything from what happened here. Michigan's white pines don't reach 150 feet anymore. The ancient giants are gone forever. But on a quiet morning in the Huron-Manistee National Forest, you can stand among trees that have been growing for a century now, not old by the standards of the original forest, but old enough to have seen the world change. The Great Michigan Cutover didn't have to happen the way it did. There was no law of nature requiring that every tree be cut. No economic principle demanding that workers live 30 to a bunkhouse. No inevitable force compelling the fires that killed thousands on cutover lands. Human beings made choices. And those choices had consequences that lasted for generations. We're still making choices. The forests we have today, the climate we're creating, the resources we're depleting or preserving. All of it comes down to choices made by people who will be long dead before the full consequences arrive. The lumber barons of Michigan thought the white pine would last forever. They were wrong. They thought someone else would deal with the mess they left behind. They were right about that. The someone else turned out to be all of us.